All right, well, we're live. My name is Dan Patterson, and this is Questioning Christianity, where we try and help you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. My guest today is Wes Huff, all the way from Apologetics Canada. He's way over there, just somewhere in the Toronto region. I'm here in Brisbane, Australia. And this episode, we're going to be diving into the questions around: have the secret teachings of Jesus been suppressed by the church for 2,000 years? If we were to jump onto social media, particularly TikTok, but also all the Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts, there is a wealth of content that makes the claim that there are alternative sources to the four canonical Gospels in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that these other Gospels, these secret Gospels, these suppressed or lost Gospels, that they tell us truths about Jesus's life and particularly his teaching that have long been hidden away, and that we need to recapture them. And so today we're going to be diving into that. Wes is something of a virtuoso when it comes to all things ancient texts. He's doing his PhD currently, kind of looking at textual transmission of the Bible and the New Testament specifically. And so it's just a real privilege to Wes to be able to have you back on the channel. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Always fun to talk about ancient manuscripts, and both credible and non-credible. I've had the privilege to be able to look at some of the original ancient manuscripts of both texts. So it's always fun to chat about. Lord knows that my wife is sick of hearing all these things. So if I can get other outlets to be able to talk about them, that's great.
Yeah. Mate, you've actually handled a number of ancient manuscripts. You've been at least around to some of the cool places where they've been discovered in the past, places like Egypt specifically, but out at St. Catherine's Monastery, where a whole host of ancient manuscripts were housed for a very long time. What's just some of the cool experiences that you've had being able to get your own eyeballs onto some of these thousands-of-year-old pieces of papyrus and parchment? What's that like?
Yeah, it's kind of a surreal experience. As a manuscript that I saw, I guess not last summer, the summer before. One of those was I was down at the University of Philadelphia for the first and second episodes of Can I Trust the Bible series that we produced at Apologetics Canada, where we're talking about, because we were about to go to Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, where over 500,000 ancient papyri were discovered, a lot of which are New Testament documents. And so we're going to talk about the discovery of these Oxyrhynchus papyri. And the very first Oxyrhynchus papyri to be discovered was a front page of the Gospel of Matthew, which is housed at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. And so I went down there, I got permission to go and see it. And it was funny because they took it out of the archive and they said the last person to see this and handle it was Pope John Paul II. So I was in a very unique group. It's literally sitting on a shelf in an archive, and very few people, they put it on display every once in a while. But other than that, a lot of these manuscripts are sitting in places where they're just kind of in these environments where they're not going to get damaged. But what I did do when I was there is I had acquired a number of pieces or rolls of papyrus that I had made. And so what I did is I sat down with the manuscript and I produced a facsimile of it. So I sat down and with the actual manuscript in hand, I copied on a piece of papyrus the text. Well, first of all, I traced out with a pencil what it looked like. And then I cut it out with an X-Acto knife, and sitting beside the actual document, I then copied the text of the manuscript. So
Very
pretty cool
cool.
opportunity to be able to, not just create a facsimile. Actually, earlier today, I was doing that as well. I was creating some micro codices out of papyrus, but let me just put this back. And
Don't drop it, mate, because in 2,000 years, someone may discover that
I
facsimile
know, right?
and be like, we have a near original.
Yeah, hopefully not. Hopefully they can out that is
I just want to know
indeed a
how many
forgery.
scribal errors did you make in the process? Or did you
What's
add or
funny
subtract
is,
things to be able to make Jesus sound more
so
divine?
yes, I was making, so P52 is arguably our earliest manuscript of the New Testament. It's a credit card size fragment of the Gospel of John. So I created this one a few months back, which is a facsimile, an exact copy of the Gospel of John. But this morning I was doing something because P52, although a lot of people might recognize this image, what I wanted to do is I actually wanted to say, okay, where does it fit on the page? So one of the things that I was doing is you can actually, based on the margins that are left calculate based on the approximate size of manuscripts from the 2nd and 3rd century, how big the page would be. So what I was doing this morning is finishing this, which is where P52 would have been on the page. And it's funny that you make the textual variant comment, because I did. I did make a textual variant, because I'm sitting there with the Greek text in front of me, and I'm copying it into what's called majuscule scripta continua. So I'm looking at actually what is a modern critical edition of the Greek New Testament, but then I'm writing it in this, what is an ancient script. So it's all capital, no spaces between words, little to no punctuation. And I actually turned epsilon, it was supposed to be a final sigma, into an epsilon. And I thought, oh shoot, that's a, I've just spelled a completely different word. It's a nonsense word, actually. But apart from the fact that I was writing with
Mate, doctoral theses are going to be written in the future on this manuscript that they've discovered. And what could this possibly mean?
But what stood out to me was interesting, and this is kind of aside from what we're going to be talking about today, was how easy that is. I'm, in that instance, arguably a scribe, copyist, and I did that completely unintentionally. And that's exactly the kind of mistakes that we find in the scribe tradition. So, you know, ancient professional scribes make mistakes. So do modern PhD students. But yeah, so hopefully
I love it.
Nobody, although I was thinking about it when I was doing it, I was like, I know some people who, if they look at this, would figure that out pretty quickly, but that's okay.
It's actually just awesome being able to consider, where do these small fragments of papyrus particularly, where do they fit into the larger whole? And you start to realize, man, what does a full manuscript of the New Testament look like in terms of just size and page numbers? And, you know, our very small text of the Bible these days, you know, we can fit in here. There's a NIV Bible from over in Cambridge. There's 1,189 chapters in there, written on fine leaf paper with tiny writing. And you realize, man, to be able to produce an entire manuscript of the New Testament, there are hundreds and hundreds of pages here to be able to do that. And then, you know, you look at the number of scribal errors. I'm always just impressed by that. I'm thinking, you know, these scribes did a pretty great job over that much to not make that many mistakes. I'm always, when you see the number of scribal errors per page, roughly, you know, it's one every 6 or 7 pages, given the number of manuscripts and pages that we have. And you just think, well, that's actually, I'm impressed by that writing by hand. I make a lot more mistakes by hand.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to produce this particular one is to show that this P52 comes from the equivalent of a pocket gospel. Like, it really would have been that big if you think about how big this page is. It would have actually been a little bit more rectangular than I've had a little bit more of a square, but they really range in size. And so this P52 probably comes from a private copy of the Gospel of John that someone would have carried around with them. We can surmise that both from the size and from the style of the text. But then you have other ones that are a lot bigger. So one of the ones that we're going to be talking about, the Gospel of Thomas, that I've also had the privilege to see in person at the Cairo Museum in Egypt, is quite a big document. It's a more analogous to something around this size. So like, that's a bigger volume. You know, you could use that for, this is actually a facsimile P66, which is a copy of the Gospel of John. So that's what it would look like. But that's what something like the Gospel of Thomas would have been, a fairly big document, as opposed to this Gospel of John that P52 comes from, which would have really been something that someone could slip into, say, the inside of their cloak.
Yeah. That's cool. Cool features. I'm still waiting for you to pull a book out of the back there, and all of a sudden the Huff cave gets revealed. Just move at the bookshelf parts. That's where you've got all the secret manuscripts in behind. Well, let's dive into the topic for today, which is just exploring these secret gospels. I'm curious about your experience on social media and just seeing the number of videos that are out there. But obviously the extra gospels, apocryphal gospels, Gnostic gospels, modern forgeries, a whole range of different ones that kind of make up this collection of other or secret gospels, so to speak. Man, it seems to be making a lot of waves. You've got really good scholarly conversations that are happening. Just what are the contents of these gospels, to try and fill that in with people like Alex O'Connor and the Within Reason podcast. But as soon as you jump onto TikTok, my goodness, it is a firestorm. Millions and millions of views of all kinds of content creators who make the case that effectively the church has suppressed these other stories about Jesus because they reveal truths about his life and teaching that are entirely unbecoming of the picture that they want to paint. And what we need to do is rediscover these ancient teachings of Jesus, and that this is where real spiritual wisdom and real spiritual life is kind of found. And it just seems to me in the last 12 months, I'm sure this goes through cycles, but there is just an explosion of this kind of content. Have you noticed a similar kind of way from figures like Morgue Official and from Billy Carson and a whole range of the Christ consciousness crowd?
Yeah, I think describing it as waves is probably a good description. It's definitely capitalized on because I think a lot of people they don't know that much about them. They might have heard the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, but to
Yeah.
actually be able to read them is still something that a lot of people it's a mystery to them. And when they do get snippets of the content of some of this literature, it does sound alluring for someone who's already kind of predicated to be interested in New Age or New Thought philosophy. There's this idea of the secret knowledge that you are divine, and that being able to be unlocked by realizing the profundity of the secret knowledge. Like all of that plays into some of the already established preconceived ideas, presuppositions of a New Age kind of philosophy. And so what I often find is that these are grab bagged, that certain aspects of the Gnostic philosophy and ideology are utilized, others are completely left by the wayside. And so it becomes not too far off from what's sometimes referred to as cafeteria Christianity, where people just kind of pick what they like and then forget about the parts that don't kind of fit into what their perspective of what Christianity should look like. I find the same thing happens with Gnosticism. Aside from the fact that the term Gnostic and Gnosticism is a modern academic category. In the ancient world, there really wasn't one Gnosticism as much as there was different types of esoteric philosophies which predate Jesus, come into the world of what is ancient Christianity and Judaism, and then start to incorporate people like Jesus into the system. But a lot of these ideas are conflicting. The Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels themselves, contradict each other in many ways, in that the key person Jesus picks out is either Philip or Mary or Judas or Thomas, but the point is that it's this person. And so if one gospel is saying it's Philip and another gospel is saying it's Judas, those actually can't be squared in light of the actual content. But overall, this category of Gnosticism is one that's a bit of an umbrella category. But aside from that, it is one that I think we're seeing more and more in the New Age spiritual but not religious crowd online.
Definitely. And you actually had a bit of a debate recently with Billy Carson, who's been probably one of the bigger figures. I mean, he made it onto the Joe Rogan podcast and a couple of other high-profile podcasts where you just find some wild claims that are made basically around some of these ancient texts, things like 1 Enoch and what it teaches about the Genesis story and Enoch's traveling to heaven and the origin story of these angelic or alien kind of figures that come down and give humans access to technology. Or you'll hear claims from some of these apocryphal gospels like that Jesus was married, perhaps to Mary Magdalene or to another companion. And you just sort of hear them repeated and people are like, whoa, what are these? Where does this fit into early Christianity? What exactly is the story? And I think you're right. In that culture where there is a suspicion of authority structures and traditional institutions, particularly the church, then you've got this recipe for people saying, this makes sense that the church would suppress true things, and I'm willing to dive in and discover it. Although people don't tend to swallow wholesale everything that's written in these sources, it does seem to be a little bit of a buffet style. Go and pick the claimings that you want to affirm as interesting because it draws a crowd and makes for good TV or good YouTube, but not really thinking through systematically, well, are these reliable sources or not? And I guess that's what I thought would be a great conversation for us today, is to look at, all right, well, what are these different gospels? What are the teachings? What's the contents? What's their origin story? What do we know about them? And then how do they fare as reliable sources on the historical Jesus? Is there a good reason why they were left out of the canon of the New Testament? Is this just a suppression effect where history is written by the winners? Or is it that they just didn't sort of ultimately rise to the standard of being a good source on the historical Jesus. What's your general thesis around that line before we dive in and have a look at each one individually?
Yeah, I think what's often missed in the conversation about apocryphal gospels is an issue of provenance and verisimilitude. So, provenance being its reliability in terms of the chain of custody of actually going back to a source that could actually and reliably communicate the information that it's claiming to derive from. And then verisimilitude is the appearance of truthfulness, likelihood, and probability. And so, in historiography, as historians, we look at something like the internal and external content of, say, the biblical gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we look for both the chain of custody and its provenance as to being written in places by people who are actually communicating that they are getting source information from the places that they're talking about by people who could very well have likely been there. And then also, in terms of the verisimilitude, is the analyzing the content. Does this strike you as something that comes from, say, a first century Jewish Second Temple source? Does it portray Jesus as a first century Jewish rabbi from an area like Galilee and Roman occupied Judea who would be saying these things to audiences like Jews and Greeks and Pharisees and Sadducees, as opposed to, say, some of the content of the Gnostic Gospels, which actually, and we'll probably get into this, portray some of the sayings of Jesus as actually far more pagan and Greek in terms of their philosophical angles than something that any type of Jew would say. So it's both an issue of, can it be traced back? Is this something that reflects the historicity of something that actually came in the time and the place? And can we look at internal and external verifications in terms of our methodologies of actually deriving historical information? So lots of generalities are thrown out about the Gnostic and apocryphal gospels, but in terms of the specifics, that's really where a lot of these documents just outrightly disqualify themselves.
And maybe a good modern example of this would be if we were to pick up something that was supposedly penned by, let's say, someone in North America. So Abraham Lincoln, a couple hundred years ago. And Abraham Lincoln was writing, and he mentions how he is a massive fan of the Carlton Blues, which is my favorite Aussie rules football team here in Australia. You would look at that and say, gee, that's really odd. Not only is that an anachronism, because at no point did the Carlton Blues exist during the time of Abraham Lincoln, but also it's from a region and a way of seeing the world that just is not at all natural to the place and time that he inhabited. And so you would say there seems to be something off. It's coming a century and a half later from a different place, a way of thinking and seeing the world that didn't really exist at the time of Jesus, and sounds at odds with the kind of worldview that he would have inhabited at the time. And so there's a crude example for anyone following along. But we might start looking at ones that probably have become big headline news over the last few decades, but have been exposed not as ancient examples of being other gospels or particularly sort of ancient forgeries, but ones that have been discovered to be modern forgeries and yet often have still been promulgated online as being these secret gospels that give us new insights into the truth about Jesus. So let's jump into the first, and this one's the Gospel of Jesus's Wife. Do you want to run us through a little bit about this little fragment?
Yeah, so the Gospel of Jesus' Wife is a fragment. It's not very big at all. In fact,
It's like a business card,
probably
basically, isn't it?
yeah, basically, yeah. And it kind of came into provenance in or prominence, not provenance, prominence in the like 2010s when it got into the attention of a number of individuals, specifically Karen King at Harvard University. So this fragment is not your typical gospel in that it's very small. It only has a few lines of information on it, and it says nothing about Jesus's death. Now, this has been outed as not just a recognized forgery, but a unanimous forgery. In that you had this entire debacle where it had come out, it had been published. Karen King had kind of touted it and staked her credibility on it a little bit. But unfortunately, what happened is that a number of people had some red flags about its text. It seemed to have a very sporadic kind of font to it. So the paleographers, individuals that analyze handwriting, were right away saying that the Coptic text of this document, there's something fishy about it. So they ended up taking a small piece off the side, they carbon dated it, and it was in fact an ancient piece of papyrus. Although that's not unusual. In fact, most modern forgeries are done on legitimate ancient papyrus or parchment, because that's, if you want to pass your forgery off as something that's going to be seen as legitimate, what you
It's going to
do
get
is
tested.
you find, yeah, you find something on the antiquities market, a piece of papyrus that either doesn't have any writing on it, or you in fact sometimes they scrub it clean and they rewrite it on top. There was also issues with the ink, so they did do some chemical ink analysis, and the chemical ink analysis was all over the place and basically said this is almost certainly not original. But the kind of nail in the coffin was that there was a couple of key individuals who identified a line of text within the Coptic as have been copied from a document called Grondin's Interlinear. So there's this very famous copy that was a PDF document that was produced by this guy. I think his name is Michael Grondin. I've used it a number of times actually in my own study, where it's a PDF of an interlinear. So you had the Coptic text on top, and then you had the literal translation of word for word underneath. And this individual had done this very, very good interlinear of the Gospel of Thomas. However, in the first edition of it, there were a couple typos talking about, textual variants. There were a couple of typos this individual had made in the actual PDF. And the forger had actually copied words from the digital version and included one of these typos. And so there's this awkward grammatical phrase within the Coptic of the Gospel of Jesus' wife that everybody was kind of saying, this doesn't fit, this doesn't work. And then when it was identified as actually having been basically essentially copied and pasted into the document, it was the nail in the coffin, as researchers found out. No, this isn't just a forgery. This is someone who has failed to realize they've used a document, this online PDF version, and they themselves have failed to catch the typo that Grondin put in the first edition. It's now been corrected in the second edition. And so the sources were not ancient to kind of derive the text of this document, but they were actually a digital version of a interlinear PDF of the Gospel of Thomas. So at that point, you had a number of things. You had kind of the sketchiness of the actual provenance of the document. There were some questions as to where did this come from. It had been tied to an individual in Europe, but not legitimately. And then along with the chemical ink analysis, the paleographical analysis, and then finally the kind of identification of the source material, this was unanimously identified as a modern forgery. And Karen King at Harvard had to eventually admit, she'd been duped, unfortunately, and this is not a legitimate, ancient document at all.
But the reason why it makes waves is because you've got these incomplete lines of text, kind of like the P52, which you showed before, where it's effectively a cutout of a larger page, and you translate these lines, and you get statements like what's on the screen. Jesus said to them, "My wife," and you think, "Wow, that's an explosive statement," because none of the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, mention Jesus getting married. It gives a strong impression that he remained single with his sort of life and mission there, and not that there's anything theologically destructive about the notion of Jesus being married, although it does raise different questions. But certainly you can understand why, for people that want to lean into a narrative that says the church is suppressing truths, there may be a direct lineage of Jesus. You think of the claims from the earlier Da Vinci Code sort of novels, and can we discover the royal family, Jesus's family, living somewhere in France? This kind of concept, it's quite explosive, but just written off entirely as a historical source as being a modern forgery. So an interesting piece, but it's not at all something that gives us much of a window into the historical Jesus.
Sure. If people are interested in really getting into the nitty gritty of how this was identified as a forgery, there's a great book called Veritas. It's the underheading is a Harvard professor, a con man, and the Gospel of Jesus' wife, by the journalist Ariel Savar, which is a very, very good read. It's very compelling. He writes very well, but he also goes into a lot of the details about trying to find the individuals who actually did produce this fake.
Correct. Well, let's jump to the second one then. It's another one you hear spoken about a lot, particularly in conversation with Muslims online. This one's called the Gospel of Barnabas. A beautiful looking actual manuscript when you are able to get a look at it. But do you want to fill us in a little bit about this one?
You know what's interesting about that image is that that's the image that if you look up the Gospel of Barnabas, you Google it, that's the image that comes up. I'm sure that might have been where you yourself found it, Dan. But that image is not actually the Gospel of Barnabas. That is
Oh,
a
really?
7th century Syriac manuscript. And you can tell actually by both the script and the fact that the script is gold inlaid, that it's very late
From that
and
time.
it's not actually what it's claiming to be. So I have no idea how that
Super
particular
interesting.
manuscript got
It's actually
associated
on
with, but that's
Wikipedia
not.
is where I got that particular image
Oh,
because I
that's
was
bad.
searching
That's
for a
not good.
high res one. Yeah.
Yeah. So because the fact is that we only have 2 copies of the Gospel of Barnabas, and one is in Italian, and the other is in Spanish.
Yeah.
And it, like you have identified there, is from the late 16th century. So, the reason why we know that is, well, I'll back up because the Gospel of Barnabas is a document that is one of the only documents supposedly from the ancient world that denies the crucifixion of Jesus, that it actually took place. But that's because it was written over a millennia and a half after the events as an apologetic against standard Christian belief. In fact, it's almost unanimously agreed upon at this point in time that it was written by individuals who are probably Muslim, because it has some comments about predicting Muhammad as well that are a little bit sketchy. But along with that, we talked a little bit before, and you used the analogy of Abraham Lincoln and, talking about a modern sports team. The Gospel of Barnabas actually has a number of those historical anachronisms found within it. So it includes a statement about an event, the event of Jubilees. Now, there isn't a Jubilee that happens in the Old Testament, which is a Jewish practice, right? At every 50 years, it's every 100 years, I think, in the Old Testament. But actually, Pope Boniface in the year 1300 changed the amount of years. No, I'm wrong. Sorry. In the Old Testament, it is 50 years.
It's 50, yeah.
But Pope Boniface changed it to every 100 years in the year 1300. And that is what's included in the Gospel of Barnabas.
Interesting.
Is the 100 year, not the 50 year. So that's already a little bit of a red flag that identifies, okay, it's agreeing not with the ancient form of the year of Jubilee, but or the event of Jubilee, but with the Middle Age one. And on top of that, the Gospel of Barnabas actually appears to paraphrase sections of Dante's Inferno. And so Dante's Inferno was written in 1314. So that is very problematic. That's the equivalent of not just Abraham Lincoln, talking about a modern sports team, but finding that out on Twitter on his iPhone. Like that's the kind of anachronism that we'd be dealing with, is that if you found a document that was talking about Abraham Lincoln, and that actually this document says that he loved slavery. In fact, he was fighting for slavery and he was doing so on Twitter. You would know right away that, well, that doesn't make any sense because the internet didn't exist, Twitter didn't exist, and so iPhones didn't exist. None of these things existed. These are anachronisms. They're historical inaccuracies. And so you can dismiss this story about Abraham Lincoln as a very poor forgery trying to insert something back into history. That's what we find with the Gospel of Barnabas. We find that it gets a number of details wrong. It's not written in an ancient language. It's written in the language of the Middle Ages. It doesn't show any indication of being either a comprehensive translation from an ancient language. It appears that it did originate in Italian and or Spanish as its primary language. And it has all these things that identified and pinpointed to the early Middle Ages specifically.
And even the claim around the notion that Judas was the one who replaced Jesus on the cross is a particular interpretation of how Muslims have tried to play out the claim in the Quran in Surah 4, 157, that it appeared that Jesus was crucified, that he was neither actually crucified nor did he die, but it only made to appear so. One of the theories that's been put forward over time was that someone else was crucified in his place, made to look like Jesus, and that was Judas Iscariot. And so here in this gospel, in the Gospel of Barnabas, you've got that written into the story specifically, which is sort of another indication of the kind of origins, the thought origins of where this may be coming from as well. But either way, you're talking here, like you said, about a millennia and a half after the events of the New Testament. So when people say, well, why don't you trust what the Gospel of Barnabas says? Well, because there's no reason to think that there is any reliable historical claims being made in something which is so far from the events of the New Testament. No evidence of eyewitness testimony that traces back to it. None of the credible signs that we would attribute towards the New Testament Gospels, those internal and external features that we use to explore the reliability of the source material, which is really useful. Well, this other one has also become reasonably popular as, again, another example of more modern forgery. But this one is just such a fascinating one. It's the Gospel of the Holy 12. And which is it's a narrative gospel in how it explores the events of the New Testament, but it just puts this radical vegetarian gloss over all of the stories about Jesus and his particular teachings. I've put one of the quotes in here that's more explicit here. This is from the lips of Jesus: "And the flesh of slain beasts in his body will become his own tomb. For I tell you truly, he who kills himself, and whoso eats the flesh of slain beasts eats the body of death." Talk to us a little bit about this one and why it's popping up all of a sudden with different TikTok figures making claims online.
Yeah, so the Gospel of the Holy 12 has been kind of capitalized on more so by individuals like Billy Carson, Aaron Abke. And I think I'm not entirely sure what the reason is, but I think it goes along the lines of confirming some of these it's an alternative narrative of Jesus that portrays him in such a vastly different perspective than we see in the biblical Gospels. And like you said, this was published. It wasn't found. There was a story that was published alongside it of being found in a Tibetan monastery, and that was Aramaic. And then you had this friar who took it to a number of priests, and somehow these priests had like direct connection with the Vatican, and they took it to the Vatican and they hid it away. But there's just a number of things with that story that just kind of it sounds too sensationalistic to be actually true. And of course, there's no, once again, provenance to going back to any type of Tibetan monastery or why this would be written in Aramaic specifically. But it was a 20th century
the claim was that they called this the Essene Bible, wasn't it?
Yeah, there have been a number of things that have tied to the title of Essene Bible. I think because the Essenes are seen as this kind of
mystical sect,
this mysterious, mystical group of Judaism that existed. You know, they were probably most likely the producers of the majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We do know a fair amount about the Essenes from individuals like Josephus and kind of their cultural practices. They were just an ascetic a group of Jews who had pulled back from the regular religious and cultic practices of Jerusalem. But a number of individuals and documents recently have tried to peg more kind of esoteric beliefs on the Essenes, which I really don't think add up with the Essenes. The Essenes were, if nothing else, very, very devout Jews. In fact, they were more devout in their religious practice as they saw it than Sadducees and the Pharisees. They were just super Jews living in the desert. And so it has been to the Essenes, but I don't think in any way that would actually credibly describe actual Essenic practice or lifestyle. But you have this document that, and so it was looked at least the quote unquote translation of it that was produced in the 20th century was looked at and analyzed by a number of scholars. And once again, it didn't have any indications of things that a first century Jewish rabbi would actually say. It didn't have the kind of markers of authenticity that would tie it to the first century. It had markers of a group that was clearly trying to portray Jesus as a vegetarian, which was the group that actually produced this document. They had an incentive because they were vegetarian advocates to then portray Jesus and say, you know, Christianity actually has it all wrong. Everybody needs to be a vegetarian. Well,
it would have slightly more credibility if the origin of this particular translation or edition actually came from beef procurers or guys that are, you know, out there doing the driving of
The
cattle.
bovine industry.
If it came from them, you'd be like, gee, that's at least interesting, because it seems counterproductive to their own way of seeing the world to be able to produce a text like this. But given it comes from animal rights activists who were themselves strictly vegetarian, it makes sense where a text that puts these teachings onto the lips of an incredibly authoritative figure like Jesus of Nazareth, it can make sense why they may want to produce a document like that.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's no mention of it prior to this quote unquote finding of it, which is unusual because the early Christians did talk a lot about Gnostic literature, which we're going to talk about in just a little bit. So these weren't lost documents, even though they're sometimes called the lost gospels. We actually knew about them. We knew a lot about them. In fact, there are still ones that are talked about, like the Gospel of the Egyptians or the Gospel of the Hebrews, that we have no physical, tangible evidence for. But I can almost guarantee you that if and when we do find those documents, guess what we'll discover? That what these early Christians who were condemning them said about them is what actually the text says is going on. That's exactly what happens when, you know, we didn't have any evidence of the Gospel of Thomas. We find the Gospel of Thomas. Hey, guess what? The early Christians who were condemning the Gospel of Thomas, right? What they say is in there is actually in there. So for something like the Gospel of the Holy 12 to be completely absent from any mentioning, there is a Gospel of the 12 that's condemned by Eusebius. But even what he articulates there is nothing comparative to what is outlined in the Gospel of the Holy 12.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe then switch to some of these ancient ones, because the ancient forgeries are interesting because, like you say, they're often responded to by some of the earliest church fathers like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and Origen and others. And so all of a sudden you get a window into the kind of challenges of being able to promote the gospel of Jesus and of his death and resurrection against all of these other groups that were starting to rise up and claim Jesus as a wise sage or teacher in their own tradition, and sort of appropriate him to that kind of an end. Maybe the one that is most well known, most referenced, is the Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas is interesting because, as you know, you would be very aware, you can go and read English translations of all of these ancient texts online. There's actually no attempt to suppress or to hide away the contents of these, but Christian scholars and the church have often made these freely available with good interactive references so that you can think about them well. And the Gospel of Thomas is very different to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which would be what we might call narrative gospels or biographies, ancient biographies of Jesus. Whereas Thomas is much more just a collection of the sayings of Jesus, supposedly. And what would instantly strike anyone who goes and reads it for the first time, and that would certainly be our invitation, go and read these for yourself and assess whether you think they're credible, is that you've got a lot of similar material in the Gospel of Thomas to what you find in the New Testament Gospels. There are a huge number of popular phrases and teachings of Jesus, particularly from his Sermon on the Mount, that you'll find contained in there. The Gospel of Thomas tells in its 114 different sayings, I think 16 different parables, 13 of which really closely line up with parables that you'll find in the New Testament Gospels. And so I remember the first time I read the Gospel of Thomas just thinking, wow, this is pretty familiar for about 2/3 of the contents of the gospel. And then the other third of the contents of this gospel are like a strange slap to the face from a very different worldview than what we're used to with Second Temple Judaism. Do you want to speak a little bit to just the origin story of this gospel, and where does it come from? When did we discover it? And what's your read on the contents within?
Yeah, so I've actually been to the place where the Gospel of Thomas was discovered in Nag Hammadi.
Very cool.
And we tell that story when we, in the first episode of the Can I Trust the Bible series, in the episode titled The Right Book. But the Gospel of Thomas,
because people may be really familiar with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance, which happened a couple of years after the discovery at Nag Hammadi, but people may not be anywhere near as familiar, because the Dead Sea Scrolls were a huge discovery of documents that seemed to be preserved by the Essene community or the Qumran community. But the Nag Hammadi text, do you want to just tell us a little bit about that discovery, and then people can go and watch your documentary for the better version?
Yeah. So the Nag Hammadi Library was discovered in 1945 at a place called Jabal al Tarif, which is a site along the desert cliffs along the Nile River. It's about 5 kilometers north of the formal city of Nag Hammadi. And in its contents were 13 codices, so 13 books, I should rephrase that. 13 codices, but in the codices were 42 books. Kind of like you would have one Bible that had 66 books. You have
Yeah.
13 codices within the Nag Hammadi library, but 42 books altogether. And so it was a number of documents. So the Gospel of Philip was also included in the Nag Hammadi library. But the one that kind of rose to prominence was the Gospel of Thomas. Now, the Gospel of Thomas actually existed in a prior fragmentary manuscripts. There are 4 manuscripts. The earliest are Greek fragments that come from Oxyrhynchus, which is another place we went to in the second episode of the Can I Trust the Bible series. But P-Oxy 1, which contains verses 26 to 31. Then there's P-Oxy 654, which contains verses 1 to 7, and then P-Oxy 655, which contains verses 36 to 40. And then there's the famous 4th century copy in Coptic, which was found at the Nag Hammadi Codex 2. And so the Gospel of Thomas became famous because of that, because it had this sayings collection, right? Like you said, Dan, 114 sayings of Jesus. And the Gospel of Thomas actually relies on a lot of the content, like you said. It quotes a number of the books of the New Testament, and we actually see that there's some content drift from the Oxyrhynchus fragments, which are from the 2nd century. By the time we get to the 4th century with the final Coptic version, there are major differences, and not just differences in terms of the textual variants we were talking about before, but there's actually content drift, which formalizes it into much more of a concrete version of Gnosticism. So we can say, I think, without a doubt, that there was a change within the text of the Gospel of Thomas as it was adopted, and as Gnostic philosophy and teaching became more prominent, because Gnosticism as a worldview, although it existed prior to the advent of Christianity, as it adopts Christian teachings and incorporates Jesus, it kind of comes into its own thing, which is what we refer to as Christian Gnosticism sometimes. So anytime you find this really concrete teaching, particularly the secret knowledge dialogue, you can identify it as a 2nd century document, because that didn't really come into its own until the 2nd century. And we see that prominently in something like the Gospel of Thomas, where there are kind of these proto aspects in the fragments that we have from the Oxyrhynchus fragments. And then when you get to the final form in its translation in Coptic from the Nag Hammadi Codex, you get much more of some formulated Gnosticism that's actually baked into the text.
And just some examples of what are those different teachings, things that set it apart from the kind of contents of what you might read in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount or in his kingdom parables in Matthew 13 or something like that. What are some of the key things that for you go, gee, this just reflects a very different Gnostic worldview?
Yeah, well, there's kind of an overarching concept of the fact that Gnostics and the idea of secret knowledge, gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. The idea is that Jesus is stealing away his disciples and he's whispering secret knowledge that's expanding their mind. And there isn't a kind of a public ministry within the Gnostic Gospels that you find in Jesus. So the Jesus of the Bible has a very public ministry. He's teaching to crowds, sometimes large crowds of thousands. And although you could say that there's like an aspect of kind of vagueness to the parables that he's teaching sometimes, his ministry is still very public, and he's making sure that he's what would not be all that different from a traveling rabbi at the time. These traveling itinerants existed in the 1st century in Jewish communities. Jesus is a good example of that, although it's very different in many ways to that. But what you get within the Gnostic literature is that Jesus has less of a public ministry and he has much more of a private ministry, where he's kind of stealing away Thomas, or he's stealing away Peter or Philip, and he's whispering things to them and making sure that they as the special disciple, and it's usually not a disciple that's associated with the biblical gospel. It's never Matthew or John. It's always a different guy. It's always Thomas or Judas or Philip, right? Not the prominent. It's not Peter, James, or John. It's some of these other individuals who, as working as like a counter to the main disciples that we read about as the closest ones to Jesus within his 12 apostle group. But this aspect of there being much more of a private ministry of secrets whispered as opposed to teachings communicated in groups, is Gnostic. It's a very Gnostic trait. And then you have things like the famous line, Logion 114 of the Gospel of Thomas, where Peter asked Jesus to dismiss Mary because he says women are not worthy of life. And Jesus says, don't worry, Peter. I will make her male so that she resembles you males, because every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. And that's how the gospel ends off. And so this is reflective of this idea that there's kind of an anti-female predilection in not all, but a lot of the Gnostic literature. And that it's not just a hypothetical, she needs to act like a male, she needs to think like a male. No, it actually means she needs to become a male, that salvation is for those who are male. And so this is
I mean, that's an
not
explosive
something,
line, right? You can understand
yeah.
why that might set off a firestorm of controversy.
And this is something that you see. You can see why someone like Irenaeus would read this and think like, that is not something that would come from the lips of Jesus, and rightly be denied.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just so anti-Christian story from Genesis to Revelation in terms of God's dignifying of both male and female in his image, and of the gospel's invitation in Galatians 3:28, neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. And so just this very different tone that's set in a passage like that to the radically invitational element of Jesus towards even having female disciples and praising their faith so often. And this kind of brings up as well this feature then that we've discussed, and we might use the language around forgeries. We talked before, particularly about those modern forgeries that are trying to claim some degree of ancient heritage. But often they attach to them a name or a series of names where they're trying to garner credibility from someone who is meant to be there. And you mentioned they always pick a lesser known figure or someone who's not one of the major players who already has a gospel associated with their name or a real leadership role within the early church, but takes on a very different vibe. What's the thinking behind this? Why are they attaching the name Thomas or Judas or Mary or Peter to these gospels when it's really hard to be able to actually trace the contents back to any of those figures?
Yeah, it's to appropriate a level of credibility that they don't actually have. So one of the things that you'll notice about the biblical gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is that they're sometimes referred to as anonymous, in that they are formally anonymous, in that if you took away the title, the gospel according to so-and-so, you would have a hard time actually identifying who the actual author is in the text. Now, Dan, you and I talked about that in terms of formal anonymity, that not being anything that's unusual within the ancient world. The vast majority of biographical literature in the ancient world, and the most prominent individuals like Philo and Xenophon, often write formally anonymous. We have the title so we know who wrote it. But I think one thing that you find within the biblical gospels in there to play into the idea of their formal anonymity is that the focus of the biblical gospels is on Jesus. He's the source of the credible information. You're not supposed to worry about who the author is, because the point is that Jesus is where the authority lies. And so when you look at the Gospel of Thomas, and it right off the bat says, these are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus, Judas, Thomas wrote down. What it's trying to do is it's trying to force that credibility. It's trying to make sure that the reader knows, oh, no, you should trust me, believe me, trust me, because I am Thomas. I'm one of the disciples. You know who I am, right? Actually, ironically, with the Gospel of Thomas, it says Judas, it says Didymus, Judas, Thomas. Now, the Greek name Thomas is a version of the Hebrew word teom, which means twin, and Didymus is the Greek word for twin. So Thomas is called Judas Thomas in the Syrian tradition, which indicates that whoever the authors of the Gospel of Thomas are, they're kind of drawing from a Syriac tradition. But what this also indicates pretty clearly is that the author had no knowledge or prior grasp of Hebrew or the meaning of the biblical name Thomas, because he ends up saying twin.
He's a twin Judas twin.
Yeah. And doesn't seem to know that that's the same word. So if this was actually Thomas, there's no way he would have said that, because it would have been redundant, especially if he was, a Hebraic Jew. It's an awkward way to phrase it. And it's indicative not only of a trying to appropriate and gain credibility where it doesn't deserve and is not original to the document. The credibility is not intrinsic to it, it's trying to force it on it. But on top of that, in trying to do that, it actually outs itself as the authorial credibility coming from someone who has no idea that what they're saying, it doesn't make sense in a Hebraic context.
Mm. And again, we just encourage you to go and read it. It's super interesting. I remember I've categorized all 114 of these sayings into 3 different categories. Ones that I've put as gospel sayings, ones that really are well aligned with the content of the New Testament Gospels. I've got one that the strange sayings, which is basically the outright Gnostic content in there. But there's this middle ground that I've called kinda gospel sayings. And let me give you a couple of examples of these ones. This is from Logion 100. They showed Jesus a gold coin and said to him, "Caesar's men demand taxes from us." He said to them, "Give Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give God what belongs to God, and give me what is mine." I just love that shift from a denarius to a gold coin, and then also "and give me what is mine," which is kind of funny. And so you've just got these slight adaptations as you go through there, and it's worth reading. But again, trying to do this credibility claim. Okay, what is the source of these teachings? Where does it seemingly align with what we know to be from more reliable biographical sources about Jesus? Where does it really depart? And can we explain where those departures come in? And when you start to do that filtering, there's nothing within the Gospel of Thomas that would have any historical credibility to change our understanding of the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth in any really credible way. Anything else you want to share, or we'll jump to the next one?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good summary. I mean, certainly there's a reliance on the Gospel of Thomas on the other biblical Gospels.
Yeah. All right, let's look at this one, which is the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is another fascinating one. People just go and read the translation again online. Do you want to talk us through a little bit about what this one is?
Yeah, so this is sometimes, for a long time, it was referred as the Arab infancy Gospel of Thomas. And this is not to be confused with the Gospel of Thomas, because they're very different things. There's a host of what's referred to as infancy narratives within sort of the apocryphal collections, if you want to call it that, in that if you read the biblical Gospels, you don't find all that much about Jesus's childhood. At the beginning of Luke's Gospel, he tells the story of Jesus, 12-year-old Jesus going to the temple with his parents, and Mary and Joseph losing Jesus, that kind of thing. But other than that, there really is nothing that's explaining what's going on as Jesus is growing up in Nazareth.
And people have a lot of curious questions about that period, right? They want to know, what was Jesus doing?
Yeah, and to the ancient biographer, and in fact, we have some ancient biographical writings that talk about how to write biography, and they specifically say, if there's something in their upbringing that is completely irrelevant to who they are as a person later in life, then it's not even worth putting in. You need to be selective with your sources because it's expensive to write, and so you need to make sure that you're not wasting space and wasting the reader's time. And so if Jesus is literally just growing up as in the house of Joseph as a carpenter's son, and apart from one story that Luke does capitalize on, maybe there legitimately is nothing else to capitalize on. But later, a lot of people were like, well, we want to know what happened then. So they start to write these stories that are infancy gospels. And the infancy gospel of Thomas fits into this. Now, prior to just a couple of years ago, the only evidence for the infancy gospel of Thomas was in the Syriac, and it was from a 6th and 7th century source. And these were much later, but a couple of years ago, and actually just published this year in June 2024, there was an earlier fragment in Greek, just a small little strip of a manuscript that had a saying that tied it directly to the infancy gospel of Thomas. And so this at least pushes back the dating of the infancy gospel of Thomas from the 6th and 7th centuries into the late 2nd century, which is very important for kind of how we're dating and understanding these apocryphal documents. But the infancy gospel of Thomas includes one of the most famous of these apocryphal stories from these infancy narratives. And it has 5-year-old Jesus playing by a stream and he creates these little figurines of birds out of clay. And the young Jesus, though, he's doing this on the Sabbath. And the Jewish officials actually catch him doing this. And in order, so they go off, they run to find Mary and Joseph to get him into trouble, rat out to his parents. And while they're running off, Jesus breathes on the birds and they turn into real birds and they fly away. And this is actually a story that's found in the Quran. It makes its way into Surah Maryam, chapter 19, verses 29 and 31. And so this is where the Quran appears to be drawing on the later Syriac versions of the story that were probably floating around the Arabian Peninsula during the 7th century anyways. But this is not a historical kind of story. It has no historical provenance. But at minimum, what we can say is, especially with this new publication, I made a post on it not that long ago, and I kind of identified, what is the significance of this? Well, I said, first, the finding doesn't actually change anything about the infancy gospel of Thomas in terms of its what we know about it. A lot of people actually hypothesized that the story originated in the late 2nd, early 3rd century, and then kind of came into its fruition in the 4th century. So for some, it pushed back the dating of it, but not for all. And then second, it doesn't change much about the language we thought it might have been written in. That most of these documents were hypothesized to have been written in Greek or Coptic originally anyways, and end up in languages like Syriac, in which we find it in its later 6th, 7th century version. And then third, this doesn't actually give us any new historical information regarding the life of Jesus. We're still dealing
Why
with
on that last one particularly?
fabrication.
Because people might say, how do you know? I mean, it's late 2nd century. It's only 200 years roughly after the early years of Jesus. How do you know that's not just a preserved oral tradition, or why do you just seem to cast suspicion over it?
Yeah, so there are a number of things within its content that actually identify it as not just coming from communities that are Gnostic in origin, but some of the ways that it describes, say, the goings on. A lot of indications with these apocryphal materials have to do with, say, geography or kind of the language that's used. When we read the biblical Gospels and Acts, one thing that stands out about them is that they use local terminology at a very unusual rate. Even something like I was reading the other day, an analysis of the shipwrecks that happen in the Acts of the Apostles. When Luke recounts the shipwrecks, he uses particular terms for things that are happening with the sailors, and even the description of the sailors, what he calls them, which are not actually Greek words, but Latin words that have been transliterated into Greek. And for a long time, people thought, well, that's an unusual thing to do. Unless you factor in the reality that these sailors were probably from Latin Rome, and that it would make sense that individuals who were coming from Rome and traveling around were actually identifying and using Latin terminology as opposed to Greek terminology. And that designates them. Luke also uses local terminology for the names of islands, which we know from those areas specifically, where other typographers and geographers, individuals like Strabo, the very famous geographer in the ancient world, he gets a lot of that stuff wrong. And it's because he's going off of secondary and tertiary literature to be able to identify these things. Whereas Luke, if he was really accompanying Paul on these missions where he says he is, he would use the local terminology because he would have been hearing what they're called from the locals. And so those are kind of key areas of the word I used earlier, verisimilitude, the appearance of likelihood and probability, that these later apocryphal gospels, ones like the infancy narrative of Thomas, they just lack a lot of that credibility, and they seem to be portraying Jesus that's a lot more what's the word I'm looking for? Like he's mischievous. He's doing
massively
things that are
mischievous. I was
like
about to
morally
say.
ambiguous. And this is
Well,
this would
that's to put it generously. I went through and I made a list of all of the things that Jesus did, and so you've got him making sparrows out of clay. You've got him killing the son of Annas with a curse. You've got him killing another boy who bumped into him. You've then got him blinding the parents of that dead boy because they complained about Jesus to the village. You've got Jesus putting Joseph in his place because Joseph is not his real father. You've got him dismissing the first teacher that his parents hire from him, Zacchaeus. It's wild stuff. You read through there and you're like, this is not at all relating to the kind of character of Jesus that we see elsewhere throughout the New Testament.
yeah, and the biblical gospels are often accused of being quite fanciful in that they include things like miracles. But one thing that we look at when we're historically analyzing a document is different levels of embellishment, because embellishment can range from very simple to extravagant. And a lot of the apocryphal literature are either in the middle to the latter half of the extravagant aspect of these embellishments, where they have these things that stories that don't necessarily contribute to the narrative, but just are very fanciful and very um, kind of outlandish to read, almost
Mm,
sometimes for the sake of being outlandish. Whereas when you read about what happens in the Gospels with the miracles of Jesus, there's always a point to them. There's always a
mm,
connection to what Jesus is doing. He's opening the eyes of the blind, and then he's speaking about seeing the kingdom of God, or he's raising the dead and talking about new life, or he's turning water into wine at a wedding for a very specific purpose, and that launching his ministry in the beginning of the Gospel of John. There are
mm,
actual reasonable explanations for why Jesus is doing the miraculous events that he's doing in the Gospels. Whereas in a lot of the apocryphal literature, Jesus is doing things because, and he's doing things because he can, right? He's bumping into children and they're dying and he's raising them back to life. Like it's accidental. It's not, there is no greater purpose in terms of the narrative structure, but it's almost like a fan fiction of, okay, you have a
mm.
guy with powers. What's he going to do? Well, we'll have him do this thing. We'll have him do that thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, well, let's jump to the next one then to give people some more insights. This one is the Gospel of Peter, and this one is more of a narrative gospel, but it is just limited to kind of recounting the passion account of Jesus, or particularly the sufferings of Jesus that focus on his experience leading up to his crucifixion and his death and resurrection. Do you want to give just maybe a backstory on this one, particularly on its history and provenance and origins, and then we can chat a bit more about it?
Yeah, so the Gospel of Peter, it was discovered in Akhmim, easy for me to say, Egypt, which is another location that I've been to. So I didn't go to the actual location where it was found, but I was in the general area where it was discovered.
That
And
counts,
much
right?
like, right, yeah, I'll give it to you. It's a lot closer than Toronto, Canada, so we got to give it something.
Yeah.
Um, and we actually knew about the Gospel of Peter long before we actually discovered the physical document, because Eusebius, the ancient historian, preserves for us a letter from an individual named Serapion, who was the bishop of Antioch in the late second century. And Serapion has a conversation with the church in Rhosis, which is in Cilicia, where they say that the Gospel of Peter, they discover this and they are reading it, this church community, and they write to Serapion and ask him whether this is something they should be reading. And Serapion kind of said, well, I'm not sure. Keep reading it. I'll give it a look and I'll get back to you. And then Serapion eventually reads it and he identifies it as containing the Gnostic heresy of Docetism, which is a heresy which was very common among different Gnostic beliefs, but denies the physicality of Jesus. So the Gnostics believed that the spiritual was good and the physical was evil. And so if Jesus was God, they didn't really have a problem with that. They had a problem with him being a man, because
Mm,
uh, we are trying to escape our physical bodies because they are prisons for our spirits. And so if Jesus is going to be God, he has to be only God. The idea of the incarnation of God, Jesus being fully God and fully man, that doesn't square within Docetism. And so he identifies this and he denies it. Now, when we find the actual document of the Gospel of Peter, what do we find? Well, we discover that it does in fact contain that docetic heresy. So you have the phrase on the screen, and they brought two wrongdoers and crucified the Lord in the middle of them, but he was silent as having no pain. Now, why is it that Jesus appears to have no pain? Well, the reason for that is because he's not actually there. He only appears to be there. I should mention that the word dokein, where we get the word docetic from, is the Greek word for to seem. And so the idea is that Jesus did not have a physical body. He seemed to have a physical body for the purpose of his disciples being able to, be discipled. But that was more an illusion than it was anything. And just like you have these infancy narratives, which capitalize on details that the Gospels and the Bible don't tell you about, namely what Jesus' childhood looked like, the Gospel of Peter also capitalizes on something that the biblical Gospels don't tell you about, in that it tells you what happens after the fact of the resurrection. It doesn't actually have a camera rolling on the resurrection event. The Gospel of Peter does. And in fact, when I did some of my language exams for at the beginning of my doctoral program, one of the pieces of literature that they gave me to sight translate through was the resurrection narrative of the Gospel of Peter. So I have kind of PTSD flashbacks of having to sight translate the Gospel of Peter off the top of my
triggers
head
your PTSD
in front of a group of language scholars. But nonetheless, I feel very well acquainted with that text now because of that. But what you have going on there is not just, the stone rolling away, but you have angels flanking Jesus. You have Jesus coming out of the tomb, and he's a super Jesus. He's a giant Jesus. And then you have the cross coming out of the tomb. Nobody tells you how the cross got in the tomb, but the cross comes out of the tomb behind Jesus, and the cross is a talking cross. It's prophesying about Jesus. And so once again, these are markers of embellishment. These are not things that would realistically happen. You also have somewhat of an apologetic against the first eyewitnesses to the resurrection being women. I think that whoever the author of the Gospel of Peter was, he was, or she, I guess it could have been hypothetically, they were embarrassed about the original eyewitnesses being women. And so what they do instead is they have all of the right people at the right time seeing the event in, as the camera's rolling. So they have Jewish and Roman officials camping out in front of the tomb. Well, once again, if we're looking for markers of likelihood and probability, Jewish priests camping out in front of a tomb is very
which would
unlikely.
make them unclean.
Never mind on the eve of Passover. All of these things are just, this would not happen. The level of probability is so low, given everything we know about the priestly class, ceremonial cleanliness, why the Roman officials would be there. They send a centurion or two, sure, a soldier maybe, but the Roman officials aren't actually going to be there. They have no reason to be there. At this point, Jesus is not he's not a threat to them. And so you have these markers within not just the kind of ideological assumptions that underlie the Gospel of Peter with its docetic teaching, but you also just have these historical implausibilities that are scattered throughout, and then culminate on the main narrative of the resurrection itself.
Yeah. Well, let's jump to the next one, just to keep wandering through, because I think this is just really helpful, giving examples as to maybe why we don't have the same degree of credibility in these Gospels, that they're appropriating names, but also when you start to do the analysis on the contents of them, they just don't make sense of the historical context or the language of what's included. It's so obviously a later source that's been developed for particular reasons that better fit that later time period and often Gnostic influences. Let's jump into the Gospel of Mary, which is another one of these examples, like with Thomas, of having secret conversations that Jesus is often having. And the Gospel of Mary, you have the disciples give Mary an invitation that she had been told things by Jesus that they wanted to know about, and so she unfolds to them all that Jesus secretly taught her. And I love that it kind of closes with this concern from Andrew, who's one of the disciples, saying, look, I'm not sure what you said is true. I do not believe that the Savior said said this, for certainly these teachings are strange ideas, so that even the Gospel of Mary itself includes a rejection from Andrew on the basis of these things being really at odds with the public teaching of Jesus that people would be aware of by Jesus. So the Gospel is preempting whoever wrote it, that people are going to struggle to receive it on the basis of what was Orthodox historic Christianity at the time. But do you want to speak to the background of the Gospel of Mary for us?
Yeah, so the Gospel of Mary was discovered in the late 19th century, and it was discovered amongst a number of fragmentary papyri. So it's a document that much of it is missing, and a lot of scholars disagree about the identity of Mary within the text. So it's believed that she was the individual who is the Mary in the text is supposed to be Mary Magdalene, but that's not that clear. Now, it appears to be dated to the mid to late second century, which is where most of this early Gnostic literature comes from. Gnosticism kind of hit its heyday in kind of the latter half of the second century, beginning of the third century, and then it almost completely dies out. By the time you get to the Council of Nicaea, there really isn't that much Gnosticism going around. And even then, at its heyday, Gnosticism wasn't necessarily that popular. As I said before, it represents a lot of different scattered groups. So the Gospel of Mary was.
You will have some people say, though, I can't remember the reference, but they say, when you arrive at a particular city, make sure you ask them, whether they're Gnostic or not, because otherwise you may end up in the wrong church. I can't remember the origins of that comment, but it was a warning from one of the church fathers to be able to check which church do you end up in. And I've heard this from a number of people who want to say that Gnosticism had almost become mainstay Christianity for a period of time. What's your read on how influential it was? Because obviously you've got these various Gnostic groups around the place, but how do you respond to a comment like that?
Yeah, I think it might look like Gnosticism was far more popular than it was because we have so many of these pieces of literature, right? Like you have the Gospel of Philip, you have the Gospel of Judas, you have the Gospel of Thomas, you have the Gospel of Mary. Well, obviously, there's a lot of Gnostics around. However, that can give us a false perception of what was actually going on. Gnosticism existed in pockets, primarily in Egypt, but in also a few places like Syria. And it was not nearly as popular as we might have thought. Now, there were different iterations of it, like Valentinianism or Marcionism, which had some Gnostic tendencies that definitely had an aspect of popularity to them. But I think what we can say is that Gnosticism as an overarching category was found in pockets of different areas of the ancient world. And they would have disagreed with one another in terms of the specifics. There was this overarching understanding of the secret knowledge of kind of an origin story. There was a lot of agreement about the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, was an evil demiurge, sometimes referred to as the Sophia. And so there were some kind of common threads that ran across Gnosticism. But realistically, what we would call orthodoxy, right, with the group that claimed to be the people that tied direct lineage to the early apostolic community, what we would just simply call Christians, they were almost unanimously quite a larger group than any of the Gnostics that we would find within the ancient world.
That's helpful.
So getting back to the Gospel of Mary, it's not necessarily claiming to be written by Mary, but it's more about Mary. In the same way that the book of Joshua is not written by Joshua, but it's about Joshua, that kind of thing. So it was part of this papyri collection that was found at the beginning of the 19th century, which also includes the Apocryphon of John and the Sophia of Jesus Christ, which are other two Gnostic texts. And alongside that, the Gospel of Mary is similar to Gnostic sayings and dialogues that we find in the style of the Gospel of Thomas. So it appears to have some sort of connection in the style and the writing, and particularly within its Coptic text, to the community that eventually produced the Nag Hammadi Gospel of Thomas, which is not necessarily a surprise. These Gnostic communities, as I said, would not have been very large and would have been pocketed. And so whoever eventually produced the Gospel of Mary it probably has some sort of connection to the community that produced the later Coptic version of the Gospel of Thomas. And there are certain aspects, like we talked about with the Gospel of Thomas, that verify a reliance on the biblical Gospels themselves. Jesus is continually described as the Savior. He's identified as the Son of Man. It mentions, along with Mary, mentions Levi and Andrew and Peter, and describes them by name, and has some sort of similar, although not completely comparative sayings of Jesus from the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. So there's reliance once again, but like other Gnostic texts, Jesus comes across far more as a pagan mystic than a Jewish rabbi. And so this is another identifier when we're looking at these documents. Is it more likely that the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas's portrayal of Jesus as a pagan, and particularly kind of like a pagan sage philosopher, is the original Jesus, and then later individuals tried to paint him as a Jewish rabbi? Or given the fact that he lived in places like Galilee, Judea, Nazareth, these areas of Roman occupied Judea, which were thoroughly Jewish, that he was at least at face value a traveling rabbinic teacher, does it make more sense that he was a rabbi who was later portrayed as a pagan mystic, or that he was a pagan mystic and then people tried to dress him up as a Jewish rabbi? Well, I think,
well, given that we've got first century sources of Jesus as a Jewish rabbi, it's easy to answer that question.
Yeah, exactly.
That's super interesting. There's just a couple of passages that I think may be helpful within the Gospel of Mary. Again, like you said, there's some levels of agreement there, but amongst the sayings, you've got, and the Savior said, all nature, all formations, all creatures exist in and with one another, and they will all be resolved again into their own roots. And you think, oh, okay, that sounds very, very much like this broad pagan mystical spirituality. You've got similar, beware that no one leads you astray, saying, lo here or lo there, talking about Jesus. And then he says, for the Son of Man is within you. Again, we talked about that as an expansion of mind and Christ consciousness and God being within us, as all of us being part of the divine is very much part of that. They ask the soul, whence do you come, slayer of men? Or where are you going, conqueror of space? And so just this language that sounds very strange and at odds with the way that Jesus both tells stories and teaches according to the Jewish traditions in the Old Testament, and presents new covenant teaching that is at some points a fulfillment of Old Testament themes, but not this radical break to a sort of binary view of the universe of light and dark and all of these other elements that you find so characteristic of these Gnostic Gospels. All right, well, let's jump then to the next one and look at the Gospel of Philip, which is another one that people raise, a similar part of the Nag Hammadi discovery back in 1945. Do you want to speak just a little bit to where this one fits in particularly? Because again, it's a different formulation style gospel than what we've had previously.
Yeah, so this one is actually, the title, the Gospel of Philip, is not intrinsic to the text, but is actually something that we have titled it based on its content. So the title applies to the text, but it's actually modern scholarship that has identified it as being referred to as the Gospel of Philip, because Philip is the main disciple that's kind of mentioned in the document. And the Gospel of Philip repeatedly quotes New Testament texts once again. In fact, not only does it quote a number of Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John, but it also has some kind of indications of being aware of 1 Corinthians and 1 Peter. So as though they were kind of already established within the Christian communities and enough to draw upon. So we're seeing this later reliance there again. And scholars also believe that the text reflects the Gnostic theology of Valentinianism, which was a 2nd century version of Gnosticism, which kind of followed after this guy, Valentinian. And Valentinian Gnosticism was very strongly denounced by guys like Irenaeus in the late 2nd century and against heresies, and by Tertullian, who actually wrote a document called Against Valentinus. And, we just have a list of individuals, Epiphanes of Salamis, in his Against Heresies. And so the Gospel of Philip is clearly a Gnostic document. In fact, it's far more characteristic of a Gnostic document than something like the Gospel of Thomas. It has much more of this kind of ambiguity to it. So it's often identified as one of the key Gnostic texts, because when you read it, sometimes you're reading and things appear to make sense, and then all of a sudden you're like, I have no idea what that line means. And that's on purpose. That's kind of
Yeah.
that's the key symptom of Gnostic literature. Is the idea is that if you were enlightened, if you actually did, if your eyes were opened and you realize that not only is Jesus divine, but you're divine, actually these kind of cryptic, nonsensical lines would actually make sense to you, because those are the secret knowledge aspects that be unlocked to you once you become enlightened. And
Can I
so
read an example just so people may understand what you mean of
yeah,
that?
please, yeah.
So light and darkness, life and death, right and left are brothers of one another. They are inseparable. Because of this, neither are the good good, nor evil evil, nor is life life, nor death death. For this reason, each one will dissolve into its earliest origin, but those who are exalted above the world are indissoluble. And you're like, okay,
Yeah,
what
yeah.
does any of that
And
mean?
and I've read it in Coptic, and it doesn't make any more sense. So it's not a language thing. And that's kind of, like I said before, that is symptomatic of Gnostic literature, and where the Gospel of Philip kind of peaks as the height of this kind of obscurity, because the point is you're not supposed to understand it, because if you did understand it, you would be enlightened. And it's confusing on purpose. But it's part of the non-commodity collection, that group that was discovered in 1945 by the farmers, and so it's one of the more capitalized on and famous ones, because it's more well preserved, especially compared to something like the Gospel of Mary, which is far more fragmentary. But or the Gospel of Thomas, which kind of has more fame, but the Gospel of Thomas is a list of sayings, whereas the Gospel of Philip has a little bit more of a narrative to it. But once again, we're using that term narrative very broadly, because it's mostly confusing.
Yeah, totally. And it's also got the part included within it that potentially suggests that Jesus kissed Mary on the so this
Yeah.
is another reason why it became a bit of a firestorm of controversy, is because you've got this part missing from the text, or that's really difficult for us to be able to understand what it would have said. But Jesus often kissed Mary Magdalene on her, and then people have to fill in the blank. What exactly was he kissing?
Yeah, so when the Gospel of Jesus' wife kind of came to prominence, a lot of individuals who wanted it to be real were kind of connecting to the Gospel of Philip and saying, well, this is just more confirmation. The Gospel of Philip is actually talking about an individual who was married to Jesus. So this, his wife is actually referring to a person, and then connected to something like the Gospel of Philip, which has this lacuna, this hole in the manuscript. But if we try to fill in the gaps, then we can make it sound like Jesus was kissing someone in the mouth.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. Well, let's do one last one, and then we'll close out with just a bit of a comparison between these Gospels and then what we find in the New Testament. Because people may ask the kind of canonical question: why do we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Who got to decide that, and why do you trust them as better sources on the historical Jesus? This one's the Gospel of Judas, and you can understand why that might be interesting for people to see, because you see Judas Iscariot as sort of this figure within the Gospels who ends up betraying Jesus, and people are searching for what are the motivations. Why would he be one of Jesus' disciples? See what he saw, hear what he heard, and then ultimately betray Jesus. Is there more to the story? And then you've got this Gospel of Judas, which maybe helps give an appeal that we could fill in some blanks behind the scenes to try and make sense of what's going on. So do you want to wander through the backstory of the Gospel of Judas?
Yeah, so the Gospel of Judas is another document that was condemned by the early church. Epiphanes and I think Irenaeus, I believe he mentions it, both condemn the Gospel of Judas. And so once again, we didn't have any physical, actual documentation for the Gospel of Judas until the 1970s. In the 1970s, in Almenia, Egypt, which is actually not that far from Oxyrhynchus, we discovered this lone surviving copy of the Gospel of Judas. It comes from the 4th century, but the Coptic translation probably is indicative of a Greek original. There are some indicators that we can see from translation style that probably indicates that it comes from something that's could be Greek, but the final form, like we find in the Gospel of Thomas, we have these earlier fragmentary sections in Greek, and then we can see it's emblematic of something that was translated into Coptic. That appears to be what's going on with the Gospel of Judas as well. But
Yeah.
the text actually has the same type of dialect and language as other Nag Hammadi documents. So even though it's not necessarily part of the Nag Hammadi collection, like a number of these other documents, there appears to be similar connections between the style and language and script that connects a lot of these communities. Maybe they're break-off communities. Like I said before, a lot of these documents contradict each other, but maybe what we're seeing is emblematic of communities who are breaking off and starting their own versions of this particular worldview with their own disciples as the head. But it was discovered as part of a larger text, which included a letter of Peter to Philip, and then the first apocalypse of James. So those are two other very distinctive Gnostic documents that were discovered in Nag Hammadi. But the Gospel of Judas also has Gnostic components to it, but the text appears to be too late in history, even if we're assuming a Greek original, to actually be connected with Judas. I mean, we have a death date for Judas, right? It's somewhere between 30 and 33 AD. And even if we're trying to push an original source text of Gospel of Judas back, it would still be too late. And this is what we see when we have individuals who are condemning it. Individuals, like I mentioned, Epiphanius of Salamis, who's the bishop of Cyprus. He wrote and talked
fact check,
about,
by the way, you were right about Irenaeus. In Against Heresies,
Okay.
Book 1, Chapter 31, he explicitly refutes the Gospel of Judas.
Nice. My memory did not fail me.
Yeah.
So it does sometimes. It really does. But that time it didn't. So we have individuals who condemn the Gospel of Judas, and not only in its content, but also say, like, this is not tied to the time. It's too late. And it particularly in its favorable treatment of Judas. So it was one of those ones that you have individuals like Epiphanius commenting on, because Judas is not the good guy in the gospel narrative, and yet whoever created the Gospel of Judas is trying to rebut that by portraying him as someone who actually is the good guy in the whole narrative.
Which is interesting, because you do see that in a lot of this Gnostic text. If you've got God portrayed as the bad guy, or in some of the earlier kind of apocryphons of Adam, and you've got Eve as doing the right thing and God being bad, and Satan, or the serpent, being the one that's actually leading humanity into becoming who they're meant to be and helping them fully mature. And so it's a recasting of the good guys as the bad guys in the Christian story as a whole. Yeah. And so again, some of the ways it portrays Jesus just seem really at odds. You've got Jesus laughing at his disciples in the Gospel of Judas. They start blaspheming in their hearts in response to his teachings, and he scoffs at them, which is just such, again, a different character portrayal of what we see ultimately between Jesus and the Gospels. But one of the reasons why I just wanted to walk through these different examples of, well, let's dive into these texts. Let's look, where do we find the first copies of the manuscripts? What do we learn about them from their origin story? Who are the people that are producing these texts? How do they seem to, where the source material that comes into it? It just starts to give us a lot of markers for being able to compare between these other gospels, secret gospels, so-called suppressed gospels, and then the gospels in the New Testament. And as someone who spent a lot of time analyzing these ancient documents, what are some of those markers that you say, look, there's a reason why when it came to identifying which books carry apostolic authority and real trustworthy contents, why was it that the early church landed on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that they excluded these other options that were there? Obviously not the Gospel of Jesus' wife, or the Gospel of Barnabas, or a Book of the Holy 12, which were much later. But what about these earlier ones that would have been at least around when sort of conversation lists, the Muratorian fragment and Tertullian and Origen and others, who were starting to form lists of authoritative books? These ones were on the table. Why were they left out and the other gospels received?
Yeah, it's a question of direct tying to the earliest Jesus community. Can we tie this to someone who either knew Jesus or someone who knew Jesus? And this is done so within a community who actually, certain individuals knew the disciples themselves. So you have individuals who we refer to as the apostolic fathers, who actually were discipled by the disciples and have these kind of direct chains of custody going back to the actual source of the information. And there's an early Jesus community which very well, individuals as part of that could have been part of, the feeding of the 5,000, or been there on the hill at the mount, or at when Jesus, ascends in heaven. There are certain uh, there's a cultural and community memory of these certain things. And this is a very small community. So when early Christians are talking about, okay, how do we connect covenant to written text, which is a very Jewish question. You have this connection in the earliest Jewish communities about covenant and written text and canonicity as a whole, within the story, as N.T. Wright puts it, that the Old Testament is a story in search of a conclusion. And the Jews had this perception of written texts being followed, the covenants that God makes, the promises being followed up by written texts. Well, Jesus establishes the new covenant. And so the organic question is, okay, where are the graphe? Where are the writings? And so when they're having those conversations, everybody agrees unanimously. And there are some questions about, say, Second and Third John, or Second Peter, or Jude, but everybody unanimously agrees, hey, the only gospels that have any connection whatsoever to someone who knew Jesus, or someone who knew someone who knew Jesus, are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We can tie the provenance and the chain of custody going right back into the early Jesus community with the disciples, or people who were directly tied to the disciples. So Matthew is a disciple, John is a disciple, Mark is said to have been the traveling companion of Peter and records what Peter says. And then Luke is a traveling companion of Paul, but it seems to have direct source information, as he says in the preface to his gospel. He's interviewing eyewitnesses. And there's a very early church tradition that very clearly dictates, okay, how would he have found the birth narrative of Jesus? Well, he probably talked to Mary. Like, there's no reason to think he didn't. And because he's very forward with his information when he says, I'm interviewing eyewitnesses who are there from the beginning. And so he's not trying to pass himself off as an eyewitness. He could do that if he's being disingenuous, dishonest, but he doesn't. He said that he's recording an orderly account for this individual Theophilus, and he's going and he's finding the eyewitnesses and the source information. He's making sure that you're aware of that fact right off from the beginning. And so all of these things culminate in the fact that we have an early church tradition going right back to the disciples of the disciples, talking about the provenance of the Gospels. We have the content of the Gospels and the fact that they tie themselves to the places and the times that they're speaking of. And then you have the unanimity and the uniformity of churches that are established all over the ancient world who are relying on these Gospels. And so there are church communities that were established by the apostles. And what are the documents that they are using when Justin Martyr talks about meeting and reading the memoirs of the apostles? Well, that's synonymous with talking about the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mind you, one gospel, right? That's the idea. The titles come from the fact that there's one gospel. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it's not that there are different gospels. They kind of become situated as a form of literature. But the whole point of that title is that the good news of Jesus Christ has come into the world, and that's established a new world order with the Jesus Revolution. And that's a story that's being written by and biographically ordered by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you have internal credibility. Whereas with these other gospels, you have these instances of external credibility trying to be forced on, whether that's with the names. The Gospel of Peter, it says right at the beginning, it's written by Peter. And then in case you missed it at the end, it says, oh, also, by the way, this is written by Peter. Like, it's really trying to hit home. Hey, I'm Peter. And I wrote this gospel. And you don't get that with the biblical gospels. And the reason for that is because they're not trying to kidnap credibility. They're not trying to shoehorn a level of authority into the text. They're letting the story and the narrative speak for itself. And that is the story and narrative that ultimately prevails, not because the winners won, but because it was actually true and liars lost, because their documents didn't have any actual historical or legitimacy to them.
That's so helpful, mate. And if you had to then, as sort of a summary for this whole video, in a minute or two, someone comes across claims about Jesus from these other gospels, secret gospels, suppressed gospels, what should they do in the face of those claims?
Yeah, I would say if we want to do good history, go to the sources that get us to the earliest time frame, and ideally from people who can actually testify, who are there or are connected with people who are there to find the information. And so, like we mentioned earlier, if you want to know about Abraham Lincoln, you go to sources written about Abraham Lincoln, ideally by people who knew him or from people who are writing during that time. You don't hop on Netflix and go watch Abraham Lincoln Zombie Hunter. It's not a credible source for the life of Abraham Lincoln. And so, from a simple historical perspective, no one is really arguing that these other gospels have any historical credibility. There are a select few scholars that I can kind of count on one hand today who think that the Gospel of Thomas might be first century because of its form in the way that it's written, not necessarily because of its content, but all the other gospels are second century and later, and nobody's really arguing to the contrary. So if I want to know about the historical Jesus, I'm going to go to the sources that get me to the time frame of the historical Jesus. I'm not going to go to secondary, tertiary, quaternary groups and sources that don't actually get me to the time and the people who actually knew him.
Mm. And according to the New Testament Gospels, the real Jesus did stand up. So if you want to know what the truth is about him, you can go and check those out. I'm sorry, I feel like I should cut that off this stream. That was bad. That was bad. It's still early in the morning here in Australia. So I'm just so thankful, mate, that you'd come and give a couple of hours to this. We'll get you back on in future to do more of these windows just into the history of Christianity and the texts, particularly of the New and Old Testaments. So appreciate what you guys do there at Apologetics Canada. And I'll put some links in the show notes so people can go and check out that awesome documentary series that they're doing on Can We Trust the Bible. It's just really worth checking out. I probably got the title wrong, but I've seen the first 2 episodes and it's rad.
Yep.
So yeah, definitely go. It's worth it. Great. You've got Wes's outfits all over there in the Middle East in the hot sun, checking out different places. So, if nothing else, it gives you a good ability to laugh at some goofy hats. That's worthwhile checking out.
Nice. Yeah. And stay
Wes,
tuned
thanks so much.
because I'm actually, I'm heading over to Turkey with our filmmaker in the spring, and we're going to be filming more episodes of the Can I Trust the Bible series. So it's an ongoing series that I'll be adding to for the rest of my life, as far as I'm concerned. There's lots of things we can talk about where you can trust the Bible. So if you've watched the episodes, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. If you haven't, make sure to go and watch them. You can find them on wesleyhuff.com or on apologeticscanada.com, and like and subscribe because there will be more in the future.
So good. Well, mate, really appreciate you. We'll catch you next time. For anyone that's still watching at this point, just a huge kudos. Thanks for being part of these long form conversations. We really want to help just shed light on many of the claims that are out there and just what kind of truth is worth believing. We're convinced that the Christian story makes sense of life's deepest questions and that Jesus is good news for all of life and for everyone. And so come and investigate. We've got a ton of videos on the channel that explore key themes, objections, doubts, but also the positive case for Christianity. I hope that'll be useful to you. And then over on our social media channels at QC Socials, you can check out a bunch of infographics where we break down the video content to try and make it as easily consumable for you. If you want to give us a like and subscribe, that's always helpful. And if you want to support the work, go to questioningchristianity.com and you can find out more on the donate tab. And that's it for today. And until next time, truth invites questioning. We'll see you later.